The scream came before the door even opened. Lyra Ashford heard it from the hallway, sharp and furious, echoing off stone walls that had never known warmth. She stopped walking. Her hands, already raw from scrubbing floors since dawn, tightened around the bucket she carried. Someone inside that room was about to make her life harder, and she had learned, in the 3 months since her pack was taken, that there was no use running from it. The door swung open before she could knock. Celine stood there in a gown the color of blood oranges, her dark hair pinned with silver combs, her eyes narrowed like a blade catching light. "You," Celine said, as if the word itself were an insult. "Where have you been? I called for you an hour ago." "I was cleaning the East Hall, my lady," Lyra said, keeping her voice flat and calm. Calm was a shield. She had built it slowly, piece by piece, since the day the wolves of the Voss kingdom marched into her village and told her people they now belonged to someone else. Celine's lip curled. "I don't care what you were doing. When I call, you come. Do you understand what will happen if you forget that again?" Lyra understood perfectly. She had seen it happen to others. A missed meal, a public scolding in front of the whole court. Worse, sometimes, though she tried not to think about worse. "Yes, my lady," she said. Celine stepped aside just enough to let her in, and Lyra entered the chamber that had once belonged to a queen, back when the Voss kingdom still had one. Now it belonged to a woman who was not a queen yet, but acted as though the crown already sat on her head. The room smelled of crushed flowers and expensive oil. A silver tray sat overturned on the floor, its contents spilled across the rug. Broken glass, a half-eaten pastry, wine soaking into the fabric like a wound. "Clean this," Celine said, already turning her back. "And do it quickly. The Alpha King wants me ready before the sun sets. There's a gathering tonight, and I intend to look like the woman who will rule beside him." Lyra knelt without a word and began gathering the broken glass, careful of her fingers, even though a small cut would heal within the hour. Wolves healed fast. It was one of the few mercies of what she was. She worked in silence, listening to Celine move around the room, humming to herself, pleased with some private thought. Lyra had stopped trying to understand people like Celine. The pack elders back home used to say that some souls were built from stone and never learned to bend, only to break others instead. Lyra thought of her elders often these days, mostly because thinking of anything else hurt too much. Her fingers found a larger shard, and she set it carefully into the small pile she'd made. That was when she heard footsteps outside the door, heavier than a servant's, deliberate in a way that made her spine straighten without her permission. The door opened again, and this time it was not a servant. Alpha King Damien Voss filled the doorway the way storms filled a sky, not because he was announcing himself, but because there was simply no room left for anything else once he arrived. He was tall, broad through the shoulders, with dark hair cut close, and eyes the color of winter ice. He wore no crown. He didn't need one. Every wolf in the kingdom knew his face, knew the low growl of his voice, knew that his word could end a life, or spare one with equal ease. Lyra kept her eyes on the glass in her hands. She had learned that lesson too. Do not look at him. Do not be seen looking at him. Servants who drew his attention rarely kept their positions for long, and she needed this position, humiliating as it was, because it came with a roof for her younger brother, and food enough to keep him from starving. "Celine," Damien said, his voice cool. "You wanted to see me before tonight." "I did." Celine's tone shifted instantly, softening into something practiced and pleasant. "I wanted your opinion on the blue gown, or the gold one. The gold makes a statement, don't you think? Everyone should remember tonight." "Wear whatever you like," Damien said. There was no warmth in it, only the exhausted patience of a man repeating himself. "I have matters to attend to before the gathering." "You always have matters," Celine said, and though her voice stayed light, Lyra caught the edge beneath it, thin as a needle. "One day, husband, you might have time for me instead of your council and your boarders." "One day," Damien agreed, in a tone that promised nothing. His gaze moved through the room then, the way a king's gaze moves through any space he enters, cataloging it without real interest, until it landed on Lyra, still kneeling on the floor with broken glass in her palm. She froze. She had not meant to be noticed. She had spent 3 months perfecting the art of being invisible in this palace, and now the Alpha King's ice-pale eyes were fixed directly on her, and she did not know what she had done wrong. "You," he said. "What happened here?" "An accident, my lord," Lyra answered quickly, before Celine could speak. It was better this way. Better to take the blame herself than to let Celine twist the story into something worse. "I dropped the tray while clearing it. I apologize for the mess." It was a lie, and she felt Celine's satisfaction radiating from across the room like heat from a fire, grateful that the servant had covered for her without being asked. Damien studied Lyra a moment longer than necessary. Something flickered behind his eyes. Not suspicion exactly, but a kind of quiet noticing, as though he were filing away a detail he didn't yet understand the importance of. "Be more careful," he said finally, and then he was gone, his footsteps fading down the corridor as quickly as they had arrived. Celine exhaled, some of the tension leaving her shoulders. "Good girl," she said, and the words should have felt like praise, but they landed on Lyra's skin like something closer to shame. "Finish the floor, and find my gold gown. I want to look like I belong beside him tonight, even if he can't be bothered to notice." Lyra finished cleaning in silence, then moved to the wardrobe, her mind circling back to the moment the king's eyes had found her. She told herself it meant nothing. Kings noticed things and then forgot them within the hour. She was not important enough to remember. And yet something in his gaze had felt different from the usual dismissive sweep servants received. She pushed the thought away. Thoughts like that were dangerous for someone in her position. By the time she left Celine's chamber, the sun had begun its slow fall toward the western hills, painting the palace halls in shades of orange and rose. Lyra walked quickly, eager to check on her brother before the evening's duties pulled her elsewhere. She found Finn in the small room they shared near the servants' quarters, a space barely large enough for 2 narrow beds, and a chest for their few belongings. He was 12 years old, all elbows and restless energy, sitting cross-legged on his bed with a piece of wood he'd been carving into the rough shape of a wolf. "You're late," he said, not looking up. "Celine needed help," Lyra said, sitting beside him. "How was your day?" "Boring. They had me hauling water again." Finn held up the carving, turning it in the fading light. "Do you think it looks like a wolf, or a very unfortunate dog?" Despite everything, Lyra laughed, and the sound surprised her. She hadn't laughed in days. "It looks like a wolf, Finn, a brave one." "Good, I was going for brave." He set the carving down and studied her face with the sharp attention only younger siblings seemed to possess. "You look tired, more tired than usual." "I'm fine." "You always say that." Finn's voice dropped, quieter now. "I heard some of the other kids talking. They said Celine hit a servant last week. Said the girl couldn't work for 2 days. Lyra's chest tightened. She had heard the same story, whispered among the kitchen staff, though no one dared repeat it too loudly. "You don't need to worry about that. It won't happen to you. I make sure of it." "I'm not worried about me," Finn said. "I'm worried about you." She reached out and ruffled his hair, the way she used to, when they still had a home, when their parents were alive, and the world made sense, in the simple way it does for children. "Don't worry about me. I'm stronger than I look." He didn't look convinced, but he let the subject drop, because that was the unspoken agreement between them. They protected each other by not saying every fear out loud. That night, Lyra was called to serve at the gathering, standing along the wall of the great hall with the other attendants, ready to refill cups and carry trays whenever a guest raised a hand. The hall glittered with candlelight and low music. Wolves of every rank gathered in silks and furs, laughing over wine, while servants moved among them like shadows given purpose. Celine held court near the head table, laughing too loudly at every comment Damien made, touching his arm whenever she could find an excuse. He tolerated it the way a man tolerates weather he cannot change, present but unmoved, his attention drifting often toward the doors, toward his council members, toward anything that was not the woman beside him. Lyra kept to the wall, refilling cups, careful not to spill, careful not to be noticed. But halfway through the evening, a commotion near the far end of the hall drew every eye. A young pup, no older than 6, had wandered from the kitchen and tripped over a serving table, sending a tray of glasses crashing to the floor. The hall went quiet. The pup's mother, a kitchen servant, rushed forward, scooping the crying child into her arms, apologizing frantically to anyone who would listen. But it was Celine who rose from her seat, her face twisted with irritation. "Control your child," Celine snapped. "Or don't bring him into spaces meant for people who matter." The words landed like a slap. The kitchen servant's face crumpled, and the pup cried harder, sensing the tension without understanding it. Lyra felt something hot rise in her chest, an anger she rarely allowed herself to feel so openly. She set down her tray and crossed the hall before she could think better of it, kneeling beside the crying child. "Hey," she said softly, her voice gentle, in a way it never was around Celine. "It's all right. Glasses break all the time. It's not your fault." The pup hiccuped, staring at her with wide, wet eyes. Lyra smiled, brushing a strand of hair from his forehead. "Look," she whispered, holding up her hand where a small cut had opened from a stray shard of glass. She let him watch, as the wound closed itself within seconds, the skin knitting back together smooth and whole. "See? Even the glass can't hurt us for long. We heal fast, you and me." The pup's tears slowed, replaced by fascination. "Do it again," he whispered. "Maybe later," Lyra said, smiling. "Right now, let's get you back to the kitchen, before the glass gets you again." She helped the mother gather the crying child, and guided them toward the kitchen doors, aware of the eyes on her back the entire way, aware that she had just done something reckless in a room full of people who might report it, who might twist a small act of kindness into something worse. When she returned to her post along the wall, Celine was watching her with narrowed eyes, though she said nothing more, too aware of the guests around her to make another scene. But someone else had watched too. Damien Voss sat at the head table, his cup untouched in front of him, his gaze fixed on the servant girl who had just calmly, casually, healed a wound in front of dozens of witnesses without a second thought. A wound that should have taken minutes to close, not seconds. He said nothing that night. He simply watched her finish her duties, watched her move through the hall with a quiet dignity that seemed entirely unaware of itself, and filed the moment away, the same way he had filed away the broken glass in Celine's chamber, the same way he filed away every detail that didn't quite fit the picture he'd been given. There was something about the girl that didn't add up, and Damien Voss had not built a kingdom by ignoring things that didn't add up. Later, long after the gathering ended and the halls fell silent, Lyra lay awake in the small room she shared with Finn, staring at the ceiling, replaying the moment in the hall. She told herself she'd made a mistake, drawing attention to herself like that. She told herself it wouldn't happen again. But some small, stubborn part of her, the part that remembered what it felt like to matter, to be seen as more than a servant, refused to feel sorry for what she'd done. Outside her window, the moon hung full and bright over the palace grounds, and somewhere across the stone corridors, the Alpha King sat alone in his study, turning a single question over in his mind, like a coin he couldn't stop flipping. Who exactly was Lyra Ashford, and why did he feel, for the first time in longer than he could remember, that he needed to find out? The days that followed the gathering fell into a rhythm that felt, to Lyra, like walking a tightrope stretched over a very long fall. Celine had not forgotten the scene in the great hall, the way Lyra had knelt to comfort a crying child, while the mistress of the palace stood scolding a grieving mother in front of half the court. She had not forgotten, and she had not forgiven it either. It began small. Celine started calling for Lyra at strange hours, well past midnight, well before dawn, small tasks that could have waited but somehow never did. Fetch water. Iron a dress that had already been ironed. Rearrange the furniture in her chamber. Then rearrange it back an hour later, because the first arrangement had been better after all. Lyra did not complain. She had learned, over 3 long months, that complaint only sharpened the edge of whatever punishment came next. She simply did the work, quietly, efficiently, and returned to the small room she shared with Finn each night, more exhausted than the last. "You're not sleeping," Finn said one morning, watching her over a bowl of thin porridge. "I can hear you moving around at night." "I sleep enough," Lyra said, though the shadows beneath her eyes told a different story. "You don't have to protect me from everything, you know," Finn said, in the careful voice of a boy trying to sound older than he was. "I know things are hard. I'm not a baby." "I know you're not," Lyra said, softer now. "But you're my brother, and it's my job to make sure you never have to worry about where your next meal comes from, or whether someone's going to hurt you for existing in the wrong room at the wrong time. Let me do my job." Finn didn't argue further, but the worry in his eyes lingered, following her out the door that morning as she made her way toward Celine's chamber for another day of quiet endurance. She found the mistress already awake, pacing the length of her room with an energy that made Lyra's stomach tighten in warning. Celine's temper had a shape to it, one Lyra had learned to read the way sailors read storm clouds. "There you are," Celine said, spinning to face her. "I need the blue silk gown, pressed and ready within the hour. And I want my hair done in the style from the northern courts, the one with the braided crown. Do you know how to do that?" Lyra did not, in fact, know how to braid hair in the elaborate style of the northern courts, but she also knew that saying so would only invite fury. "I'll do my best, my lady." "Your best had better be good enough," Celine snapped. "The Alpha King's Council is meeting today, and I intend to be present. I intend to look like a queen, Lyra, because that is what I will be very soon, and I need everyone in this palace to start remembering it." Lyra set to work, pressing the gown with careful, practiced motions, while her mind worked through the problem of the northern braid. She had watched the other servants style hair before, had picked up small tricks here and there out of necessity rather than interest, and she pieced together something close enough to what Celine wanted, weaving 3 thin braids into a circle atop her head, pinning it with the silver combs Celine favored. When she finished, Celine studied herself in the mirror for a long moment, turning her head this way and that. "It's not perfect," she said, "but it will do." She did not thank Lyra. She never did. The council meeting that day drew most of the palace's attention, wolves of every rank gathering in the corridors outside the meeting hall, whispering about matters of borders and treaties, and the growing tension with a neighboring kingdom to the east. Lyra had no reason to be near the meeting hall herself, but Celine insisted on bringing her along to wait outside with a tray of refreshments, in case the council required anything during their long hours of debate. It was there, standing quietly against the corridor wall with her tray balanced carefully in her hands, that Lyra first laid eyes on the visiting emissary. He arrived with an entourage of 6 wolves, all dressed in deep green cloaks marked with a silver crescent moon, the sigil of a kingdom Lyra recognized only vaguely from stories her grandmother used to tell. A kingdom far to the east, old and proud, one that had existed long before the Voss family rose to power in these lands. The emissary himself was younger than Lyra expected, perhaps not much older than Damien, with sharp cheekbones and eyes the color of dark amber. He moved through the corridor with the easy confidence of a man accustomed to being watched, and watched he was, by nearly every servant and courtier in the hall. But it was his gaze that caught Lyra off guard. As he passed her position along the wall, his eyes swept over the gathered servants the way any noble's gaze might, until they landed on her, and stopped. He did not look away quickly, the way most nobles did when their eyes accidentally met a servant's. Instead, he paused, just for a moment, his brow furrowing slightly, as though he were trying to place a memory he couldn't quite reach. Then one of his companions murmured something in his ear, and he moved on, disappearing through the doors of the council chamber, leaving Lyra with an uneasy feeling she couldn't quite name. "Did you see that?" whispered one of the other servants standing nearby, a young woman named Wren who worked in the kitchens. "The emissary from the Eastern Court. They say he's here about some old dispute over territory, but my cousin, who works near the stables, heard the guards saying it's about something else entirely." "Something about a lost bloodline." "A lost bloodline," Lyra repeated, keeping her voice low. "Some old family line the Eastern Court thought was wiped out generations ago," Wren said, clearly delighted to have an audience for her gossip. "They say the Eastern Kingdom has been searching for years, hoping to find an heir. Strange business, if you ask me. Why would anyone care about old bloodlines when there's a war brewing on 3 different borders?" Lyra said nothing, but the words settled uneasily in her chest, though she couldn't have said why. She had never given much thought to her own family history, beyond her parents and grandparents, simple wolves from a simple pack, nothing special, nothing anyone would search for across kingdoms. And yet the emissary's gaze lingered in her memory the rest of the day, a small splinter she couldn't quite work free. The council meeting stretched on for hours, well past the point Lyra expected, and by the time the doors finally opened and the wolves began filing out, the candles along the corridor had burned low, casting long shadows across the stone floor. Celine emerged looking pleased with herself, having apparently made whatever impression she'd hoped to make on the visiting dignitaries, and dismissed Lyra for the evening with barely a glance. Lyra gathered her tray and made her way toward the kitchens, grateful for the reprieve, when a voice stopped her in the empty corridor. "You." She turned to find Damien Voss standing several paces away, having apparently followed her from the meeting hall, his expression unreadable in the dim candlelight. "My lord," Lyra said, dropping into a small bow, careful to keep her tray steady. "Is something wrong?" "That's what I intend to find out," he said, stepping closer. "The healing. At the gathering. I want to know how you did it." Lyra's heart began to beat faster, though she kept her face carefully composed. "It's nothing unusual, my lord. Many wolves heal quickly from small wounds." "Not that quickly," Damien said. "I've seen wolves heal fast. What you did was faster. Instant, nearly." He studied her with the same intensity he'd shown at the gathering, as though he were trying to solve a puzzle whose pieces refused to fit together neatly. "Where are you from, Lyra Ashford?" The use of her full name startled her. She hadn't realized he knew it. "A small pack in the northern hills, my lord. It was absorbed into your kingdom's territory a few months ago." "And your parents? Your bloodline?" "My parents are gone," Lyra said, the old grief rising briefly before she pushed it back down. "They were simple wolves. Farmers, mostly. There's nothing unusual about my family, my lord." Damien studied her for a long moment, and Lyra had the distinct feeling he didn't quite believe her, though he didn't press further. "Very well," he said finally. "Return to your duties." She bowed again and hurried away, her heart still racing, though she couldn't have said whether it was from fear or something else entirely, something that felt uncomfortably close to hope, a feeling she had trained herself not to indulge in months ago. That night, as she lay beside her sleeping brother, staring up at the cracked ceiling of their small shared room, Lyra found herself thinking of the emissary's amber eyes, the way they had lingered on her face, as though searching for something familiar. She thought of the whispered stories about a lost bloodline, of the mark on her wrist that she had always assumed was simply a birthmark, an unremarkable pattern of pale lines that curved like a crescent moon. She had never thought much of the mark before. Now, in the quiet darkness of her small room, she found herself staring at her own wrist, tracing the pale lines with her finger, wondering for the first time in her life whether there might be more to her story than she had ever allowed herself to imagine. Sleep came slowly that night, tangled with half-formed dreams of forests she had never walked and voices she had never heard, whispering a name that was not quite her own, and yet felt, somehow, like it belonged to her all the same. The following morning brought new trouble, as Celine, having apparently spent the night stewing over some imagined slight, decided that Lyra's work had grown careless and demanded she scrub the entire length of the Western Hall's stone floor by hand, a task that would normally be split among 4 servants working together. Lyra worked through the day without complaint, her knees aching against the cold stone, her hands raw and cracked by mid-afternoon. But even as her body protested the punishing labor, her mind kept drifting back to the emissary's amber eyes, to Damien's pointed questions, to the mark on her wrist that suddenly felt less like a birthmark and more like a question waiting to be answered. Something was shifting in the palace, something Lyra couldn't quite name but could feel all the same, like a change in weather before the first drop of rain fell. She didn't know yet whether that shift would bring her closer to freedom or closer to danger, but she understood, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, that her quiet, invisible existence within these palace walls was beginning to end. Whether that ending would be a blessing or a curse, only time would tell. The rumor about the Eastern emissary spread through the palace, faster than fire through dry grass. By the 3rd day of his visit, every servant in the kitchens seemed to have a different version of the story, each more elaborate than the last. Some said the Eastern Kingdom wanted to reclaim old territory. Others insisted it was about a marriage alliance. But the story that kept circling back, the one that made the hair on Lyra's arms stand up every time she heard it, was the one about the lost bloodline. "They say the old royal line of the Eastern Court had a gift for healing," Wren whispered one afternoon, as they folded linens together in the small laundry room. "Not just fast healing, mind you, but something bigger, something that could mend broken bonds between packs, settle old feuds, bring rival families back together. They say the gift skipped a generation once, then vanished entirely when the last of the bloodline disappeared during the wars 2 decades ago." Disappeared how? Lyra asked, trying to keep her voice light, though her hands had gone still against the linen. Wren shrugged. No one knows for certain. Some say the family was killed. Others say a child was smuggled away to keep her safe, hidden somewhere no one would think to look. A farming village, maybe. Somewhere ordinary. She glanced sideways at Lyra with a teasing grin. Wouldn't that be something, if the lost princess turned up scrubbing floors in the Alpha King's palace? Lyra forced a laugh, though it came out thinner than she intended. I doubt a princess would end up polishing silver and ironing gowns for someone else's mistress. Suppose not, Wren said, losing interest in the topic as quickly as she'd found it, moving on to gossip about one of the palace guards she fancied. But Lyra couldn't let the conversation go so easily. That night, alone in her small room, while Finn slept soundly beside her, she pulled back her sleeve and studied the mark on her wrist again, tracing its curved lines with careful fingers. It did look like a crescent moon, she realized now, seeing it with fresh eyes. The same crescent moon stitched into the cloaks of the Eastern emissary's entourage. She told herself it meant nothing. Birthmarks came in all shapes. It was foolish to build a fantasy out of a coincidence. Foolish to let herself hope for something as impossible as a hidden royal bloodline, when she had spent her entire life believing herself to be nothing more than an ordinary wolf from an ordinary family. And yet the thought refused to leave her alone. The following day, Celine's temper reached new heights. She had learned, through whatever channels she used to gather palace gossip, that the Eastern emissary had asked several members of the kitchen staff pointed questions about servants with unusual healing abilities, and though no names had been given, Celine's suspicion had landed squarely on Lyra. "What did you tell him?" Celine demanded, cornering Lyra in the hallway outside her chamber, her voice low and dangerous. "The emissary. What did you say to him?" "I haven't spoken to him at all, my lady," Lyra said honestly. "I've only seen him in passing." "Don't lie to me," Celine hissed, stepping closer, close enough that Lyra could smell the sharp floral perfume she favored. "I know what you did at the gathering. Healing that child's cut in front of everyone, showing off like some kind of performer. Now the Eastern court is asking questions, and I intend to know why." "I wasn't showing off," Lyra said, keeping her voice steady despite the pounding of her heart. "I was comforting a frightened child. That's all it was." Celine's eyes narrowed further, searching Lyra's face for some crack in her composure, some sign of the lie she was certain existed. Finding none, she pulled back, though the suspicion didn't leave her expression. "Watch yourself," she said finally. "I don't know what game you're playing, but I promise you, I will not allow some servant girl to distract attention away from what belongs to me. Not the Alpha King's attention, and not the Eastern courts either." She swept away down the corridor, leaving Lyra standing alone, her pulse still racing, her mind spinning through the implications of what had just happened. Celine suspected something, and if Celine suspected, it was only a matter of time before she acted on that suspicion, one way or another. Lyra spent the rest of the day in a state of careful vigilance, watching every shadow, listening for every whisper, aware that the fragile invisibility she had built for herself over 3 months was crumbling faster than she could repair it. That evening, as she carried a stack of folded linens toward the eastern wing of the palace, a task that took her past the guest chambers where the emissary and his entourage were housed, she nearly collided with the emissary himself, stepping out of his chamber at the exact moment she rounded the corner. "Forgive me," Lyra said quickly, steadying the linens in her arms and dropping into a small bow, keeping her eyes lowered. "No harm done," the emissary said, and something in his tone made her look up despite herself. He was studying her with the same intense curiosity she'd noticed during the council meeting, his amber eyes moving over her face, as though searching for the answer to a question he hadn't yet asked aloud. "You're the girl from the gathering," he said. "The one who healed the child's wound." Lyra's stomach dropped. "I only comforted him, my lord. It wasn't anything unusual." "I don't believe that's true," the emissary said, though his tone remained gentle, almost kind. "My name is Callan. I represent the Eastern Court, and I have been searching for someone for a very long time." He paused, studying her a moment longer. "Would you tell me your name?" "Lyra," she said, hesitating only briefly. "Lyra Ashford." "Ashford." Callan repeated the name softly, as though testing its weight. "May I ask you something, Lyra Ashford?" A strange question, perhaps, but I hope you'll indulge me. She nodded, though every instinct told her to excuse herself and walk away as quickly as possible. Do you have a mark on your body? Callan asked. Something shaped like a crescent moon, pale against your skin, likely on your wrist or perhaps your shoulder? The linens nearly slipped from her arms. She caught them just in time, her heart hammering so loudly she was certain he could hear it. How did you know that? Something shifted in Callan's expression, a mixture of hope and disbelief, so raw it made Lyra's chest ache to witness it. Because I have spent 20 years searching for a girl with exactly that mark, he said quietly. The last surviving heir of a bloodline my kingdom believed lost forever. A bloodline with the power to heal what most believe cannot be mended. Lyra took a step back, shaking her head. You're mistaken. My parents were simple farmers. There's nothing special about my family. Perhaps your parents never told you the truth, Callan said gently. Perhaps they hid it to protect you, the way so many families hid their children during the wars. Lyra, I don't say this to frighten you. I say it because I believe you deserve to know who you truly are. Before Lyra could respond, footsteps echoed from the far end of the corridor, and both of them turned to see Damien Voss approaching, his expression darkening the moment he registered the scene before him. His mistress's servant, standing close to the Eastern emissary, engaged in what was clearly no ordinary conversation. Is something wrong here? Damien asked, his voice carrying the particular calm that Lyra had come to recognize as dangerous, the calm of a predator deciding whether to strike. Nothing wrong at all, Callan said smoothly, though his eyes flicked briefly back to Lyra before returning to the king. I was simply asking your servant for directions. I seem to have gotten turned around in these unfamiliar halls. Damien's gaze moved to Lyra, searching her face the way he had searched it before, as though trying to read something written just beneath the surface. Is that true? Yes, my lord, Lyra said, grateful for Callan's quick cover, though she wasn't entirely sure why the emissary had chosen not to reveal what he'd just told her. I was helping the emissary find his way back to his chamber. Damien's expression didn't fully relax, but he nodded, gesturing for Lyra to continue on her way. She bowed quickly and hurried off, her mind racing, her hands trembling around the stack of linens she still carried, barely aware of Callan's parting words drifting after her down the corridor. We're not finished, Lyra Ashford, not by a long way. That night, sleep refused to come. Lyra lay awake beside her sleeping brother, staring at the ceiling, turning Callan's words over and over in her mind. A bloodline, with the power to heal what most believe cannot be mended. It sounded impossible, the kind of story told to children before bed, not something that could possibly apply to her. A girl who had spent the last 3 months scrubbing floors and enduring the casual cruelty of a woman who believed herself destined for a crown. And yet the mark on her wrist burned faintly beneath her fingertips as she traced it again, as though something within her had begun, however faintly, to wake up. Whatever truth waited to be uncovered, Lyra understood now that there was no going back to the careful invisibility she had built for herself. The Eastern Court knew her name. The Alpha King had begun to notice her, and somewhere in the palace, Celine's suspicion was growing sharper by the day, a blade being slowly, patiently sharpened, waiting for the right moment to fall. Lyra closed her eyes at last, not toward sleep, but toward the quiet, terrifying understanding that her life was about to change, in ways she could neither predict nor prevent, and that she would need every ounce of strength she possessed to survive whatever came next. 3 days passed before Lyra saw Callan again, 3 days filled with Celine's mounting suspicion, and a strange, watchful quiet from Damien that unsettled her more than his usual indifference ever had. She kept to her duties, kept her eyes lowered, kept the mark on her wrist hidden beneath long sleeves, even in the warmth of the palace kitchens, as though covering it might somehow undo the conversation that had already taken place. But truths, once spoken aloud, have a way of refusing to stay buried. It happened on a quiet afternoon, while Lyra was sent to deliver a message to the palace historian, an elderly wolf named Edwin, who kept himself buried among scrolls and record books in a tower room few servants ever visited. Celine had grown impatient, waiting for confirmation of some genealogical detail related to her own family's standing, eager to prove her lineage worthy of a crown, and had sent Lyra to retrieve the documents personally. Edwin's tower room smelled of old parchment and candle wax, shelves stretching from floor to ceiling, crowded with records dating back generations. The old wolf himself sat hunched over a desk near the window, squinting at a faded document through a pair of thick spectacles. "Lyra Ashford," he said without looking up, surprising her. "I wondered when you'd come. You know my name?" Lyra asked, setting down the small tray of tea she'd brought along as an excuse for the visit. "Everyone in this palace knows your name by now, child, whether you realize it or not." Edwin finally looked up, his pale eyes sharp despite his age. "The Eastern emissary has been asking me questions. About old bloodlines. About a mark shaped like a crescent moon." Lyra's chest tightened. "And what did you tell him?" Edwin gestured for her to sit, and though every instinct told her to refuse, to hurry back to Celine's chamber and pretend this conversation had never happened, curiosity won out over caution. She sat. "I told him what the records show," Edwin said, pulling a thick, leather-bound book from a nearby shelf, its pages yellowed with age. There was a bloodline, generations ago, known simply as the Moonbound line. They possessed a rare gift, distinct from ordinary wolf healing. Where most of us mend our own wounds, the Moonbound could mend the wounds of others, instantly, completely, regardless of severity. More than that, the old records suggest they carried an even rarer gift, one not seen in centuries. The ability to heal not just flesh, but bonds, broken alliances, fractured pacts, old festering grudges between families who had warred for generations. He opened the book to a page marked with a faded ribbon, revealing an illustration that made Lyra's breath catch in her throat. A crescent moon, rendered in careful ink, identical in every detail to the mark on her wrist. "The line was believed extinguished during the border wars 2 decades ago," Edwin continued. "The family was hunted, their territory seized, their name erased from most official records, to prevent rival kingdoms from using the bloodline as a political weapon. But rumors persisted for years that a single child survived, smuggled away before the attack, hidden somewhere safe. And you believe that child is me," Lyra said quietly, though it wasn't really a question. Edwin studied her for a long moment. "I believe the evidence is compelling. Your age matches, the mark matches, and when the emissary described the healing you performed at the recent gathering, instantaneous, complete, exactly the kind of gift the old records describe, I found it difficult to dismiss as coincidence." Lyra sat in silence, absorbing the weight of what he'd told her, the story reshaping itself around a version of her past she had never imagined possible. Her parents, simple farmers as far as she'd always known, had never once mentioned anything about a hidden bloodline, a hunted family, a smuggled child. Had they known? Had they spent her entire childhood protecting a secret so dangerous it could have gotten them all killed? "Why would they never tell me?" she asked, more to herself than to Edwin. "Perhaps to keep you safe," Edwin said gently. "A secret unknown cannot be tortured out of a child too young to understand its weight. Perhaps they intended to tell you when you were older, when you could understand the danger, and simply ran out of time." Grief rose in her chest, sharp and unexpected. Grief for parents she had already mourned once, and now had to mourn again in an entirely new way. Grief for a truth they had carried alone, perhaps out of love, perhaps out of fear, and had taken with them when they died. "What happens now?" she asked, when she trusted her voice again. "If this is true, if I really am what you and the emissary believe I am, what does that mean for me?" Edwin closed the old book carefully, setting it aside. "That, child, is not a question I can answer. But I suspect you won't be able to avoid finding out for much longer. Word travels quickly in a palace like this one, and secrets have a way of surfacing exactly when you least want them to." His warning proved prophetic sooner than either of them expected. That evening, as Lyra made her way back toward the servants' quarters, exhausted from the weight of everything she'd learned, she was intercepted in a quiet corridor by one of Celine's personal attendants, a nervous young wolf named Ida who cast anxious glances over her shoulder as she spoke. "Celine knows," Ida whispered, "about the emissary, about what he's been asking. She's furious, Lyra. She thinks you've been hiding something from her, and she's not going to let it go." "What is she planning?" Lyra asked, dread pooling in her stomach. "I don't know exactly," Ida admitted, "but I overheard her talking to her father this afternoon. Something about needing to eliminate any threat to her position before it grows too large to control. I thought you should know. Be careful, Lyra. Please." Ida hurried away before Lyra could ask further questions, leaving her alone in the dim corridor, the weight of everything pressing down on her all at once. A hidden bloodline, a furious mistress plotting against her, an alpha king whose attention had begun to shift in ways that felt both dangerous and, if she was honest with herself, quietly thrilling. She returned to her small room that night to find Finn already asleep, his carved wolf figure clutched loosely in one hand, even in slumber. She sat beside him for a long moment, watching him breathe, grateful beyond words that he remained unaware of the storm gathering around them. Whatever came next, whatever Celine planned, whatever truth the Eastern Court eventually confirmed about her bloodline, Lyra understood one thing with absolute clarity. She could no longer afford to be invisible. The careful, quiet existence she had built for herself over the past 3 months was ending, whether she was ready for it or not, and she would need to find a strength within herself she hadn't yet been forced to discover. Ski. She thought of the crescent moon mark on her wrist, of the ancient bloodline it apparently represented, of a gift for healing not just wounds but broken bonds between people who had every reason to hate one another. If such a gift truly lived within her, she found herself wondering, quietly, in the dark stillness of her small room, whether it might be powerful enough to heal even her own fractured, uncertain heart. Sleep, when it finally came, brought dreams of forests bathed in silver moonlight, of a family she had never known reaching toward her with open arms, and of a single warning whispered on the wind, over and over, until she woke with a start just before dawn. Trust carefully. Not everyone who offers a crown means to let you wear it. The accusation came at midday, in front of the entire court, delivered with the precision of a blade aimed directly at the throat. Lyra had been summoned to the Great Hall without explanation, pulled from her duties in the laundry room by 2 of the palace guards who refused to answer her questions, their expressions carefully blank in the way that told her something serious was about to happen. She walked between them through the corridors, her heart pounding, her mind racing through every possible explanation, none of them good. The Great Hall was already crowded when she arrived. Nobles and courtiers gathered in small clusters, whispering among themselves, their eyes tracking her entrance with open curiosity. At the front of the hall, standing beside the raised platform where Damien typically held court, Celine waited with an expression of triumphant fury, her arms crossed, her chin lifted in a way that made Lyra's stomach twist with dread. "There she is," Celine announced, loud enough for the entire hall to hear. "The thief." The word landed like a physical blow. Lyra stopped walking, staring at Celine in genuine confusion. "I don't understand. What theft?" "Don't play innocent," Celine snapped, striding forward until she stood only a few feet away. A ruby necklace, part of the royal treasury, was discovered missing 3 days ago. This morning, it was found hidden among your belongings. Care to explain that? Lyra's blood ran cold. "That's not possible. I've never even seen a ruby necklace, let alone stolen one." "The guards found it in your room," Celine said, gesturing toward one of the soldiers standing nearby, who held up a small velvet pouch, opening it, to reveal a necklace glittering with deep red stones, unmistakably valuable, unmistakably the kind of object that would never belong to a servant. "Hidden beneath your mattress, wrapped in one of your brother's old shirts. Rather clumsy, for someone claiming to be innocent." Lyra's mind raced, panic clawing up her throat. She had never seen that necklace before in her life, had certainly never hidden anything beneath her mattress, but the evidence sat there gleaming in the guard's outstretched hand, damning and impossible to argue against. "I didn't do this," she said, her voice shaking, despite her effort to remain calm. "Someone must have planted it. I would never steal anything, especially not something that could put my brother in danger." "A convenient story," Celine said, her voice carrying easily across the silent hall. "But theft from the royal treasury cannot go unpunished, regardless of how sympathetic the excuse. I demand she be flogged before the court, as an example to any other servant who might consider taking what doesn't belong to them." Lyra felt the blood drain from her face, her legs suddenly unsteady beneath her. She had heard stories of such punishments, had seen the aftermath on other unfortunate servants over the past 3 months, and the thought of it happening to her, for a crime she hadn't committed, sent a wave of nausea rolling through her stomach. "Please," she said, hating the desperation in her own voice but unable to suppress it. "I swear to you, I have never seen that necklace before today. Someone is trying to hurt me." Enough. The single word cut through the murmuring crowd like a blade, and every eye in the hall turned toward the entrance, where Damien Voss stood, having apparently arrived in the middle of the accusation, his expression carved from stone. He walked forward slowly, his gaze moving between Celine and Lyra, taking in the scene with the same careful, assessing attention he brought to every problem placed before him. "Explain this from the beginning," he said, addressing Celine directly. "Who discovered the necklace missing?" "I did," Celine said. "I noticed it gone from my personal collection 3 days ago and reported it immediately to the guards." "And what led the search to Lyra's room specifically?" Damien asked, his tone carefully neutral, though Lyra thought she detected something sharper beneath the surface, something that made Celine's confidence flicker, just slightly. "An anonymous tip," Celine said. "Someone reported seeing her acting suspiciously near the Treasury wing." "Who reported this tip?" "I don't know their name," Celine said, a note of impatience creeping into her voice. "Does it matter? The necklace was found. That should be enough." Damien's jaw tightened, almost imperceptibly. He turned to Lyra, studying her face with an intensity that made her want to look away, though she forced herself to meet his gaze instead, hoping desperately that he could see the truth written there. "Where were you 3 days ago, at the time this necklace supposedly went missing?" "In the laundry room, my lord," Lyra said quickly. "All day. Ask any of the other servants who worked alongside me. They can confirm I never left the room except for meals." "Bring them," Damien said, his voice carrying across the hall with quiet authority. 2 guards departed immediately, returning within minutes with 3 servants from the laundry room, including Wren, whose eyes widened with fear at finding herself suddenly at the center of court attention. "Confirm her whereabouts," Damien said, addressing the trembling servants. "Truthfully, lying to me in this hall carries its own consequences." Wren stepped forward, though her voice shook as she spoke. "She was with us all day, my lord. From sunrise until well past dark. She never left the laundry room except to eat, and even then, only for a few minutes each time." The other 2 servants confirmed the same story, their voices growing steadier as they spoke, apparently drawing courage from Wren's example. Damien listened carefully, his expression unreadable, before turning back to Celine, whose confident posture had begun to waver. "It seems there's a significant problem with your accusation," Damien said. "If Lyra never left the laundry room during the time frame in question, she couldn't have stolen anything from the Treasury wing, which I understand is located on the entirely opposite side of the palace." "Perhaps the theft happened at a different time than I initially believed," Celine said quickly, though her voice had lost much of its earlier certainty. "The important matter is that the necklace was found in her possession." "Was it?" Damien said, his tone growing colder. "Guard, bring me the pouch." The soldier stepped forward, offering the velvet pouch containing the necklace. Damien examined it carefully, turning it over in his hands, studying the clasp, the stitching along the edges, before his gaze lifted back to Celine, with an expression that made the entire hall fall silent. "This pouch bears the maker's mark of a jeweler in the Eastern Quarter," Damien said. "A shop I happen to know caters almost exclusively to noble clientele, given the cost of their work. Tell me, Celine, how would a servant girl, earning barely enough to feed herself and her brother, come to possess a velvet pouch from a jeweler that charges more for a single piece than most servants earn in a year?" Celine's face had gone pale. "I wouldn't know how she obtained it." "Perhaps she stole the pouch as well." "Or perhaps," Damien said, his voice dropping low, dangerous in its quiet control, "someone with access to that particular jeweler planted this necklace to frame an innocent servant for a crime she never committed." The silence in the hall stretched taut as a bowstring. Every eye had shifted from Lyra to Celine, whose composure was crumbling visibly under the weight of the king's scrutiny. "I don't know what you're implying," Celine said, though her voice had lost all its earlier confidence. "I think you know exactly what I'm implying," Damien said. "I've watched you grow increasingly hostile toward this servant over the past several days, ever since the Eastern emissary took an interest in her. I find it difficult to believe that hostility and this sudden, conveniently timed accusation are unrelated." "This is absurd," Celine said, though her voice cracked slightly on the word. "I am the woman meant to rule beside you, and you would take the word of a servant over mine?" "I would take the word of truth over anyone's," Damien said. "And the truth, as it currently stands, does not favor your accusation." He turned to the guards, still holding the necklace. "Return this to the treasury, pending a proper investigation into its actual disappearance, and release Lyra Ashford immediately. She will face no punishment for a crime the evidence suggests she did not commit." The guards moved to comply, and Lyra felt her knees nearly buckle with relief, though she forced herself to remain standing, aware of the eyes still watching her from every corner of the hall. Celine stood frozen for a long moment, her fury barely contained beneath a thin veneer of composure, before turning sharply and storming from the hall without another word, her attendants scrambling to follow in her wake. Damien watched her go, his expression still carved from stone, before turning his attention back to Lyra, who remained standing in the center of the hall, uncertain what came next. "You may return to your duties," he said, though something in his tone had shifted, softened almost imperceptibly. "I apologize for the ordeal you've been put through today. It will not happen again." "Thank you, my lord," Lyra said quietly, her voice still unsteady. As she turned to leave, gratitude and lingering fear tangled together in her chest. She caught sight of Callan standing near the back of the hall, having apparently witnessed the entire confrontation. His expression, unlike the curious, judgmental faces of the assembled court, held something closer to quiet respect, and beneath that, an unmistakable flicker of concern. Lyra hurried from the hall, her legs finally giving way to the trembling she'd been suppressing, grateful beyond words to have survived an accusation that could have ended, quite literally, in her destruction. But even as relief flooded through her, a colder realization settled alongside it. Celine had shown, today, exactly how far she was willing to go to protect her position, and if a single failed accusation hadn't been enough to teach her caution, Lyra understood with grim certainty that this would not be the last attempt to remove her from the palace, one way or another. The investigation into the missing necklace moved quickly once Damien ordered it, and within 2 days, the truth had unraveled completely, exposing a plot far more calculated than anyone in the Great Hall had realized. It was Edwin, working alongside the palace guard captain, who first uncovered the connection between Celine's personal maid and the jeweler whose pouch had held the false evidence. Under careful questioning, the maid, a nervous young wolf named Petra, confessed everything, her voice trembling as she described how Celine had ordered her to purchase the necklace using funds from her personal allowance, then instructed her to plant it among Lyra's belongings, while the laundry staff worked their long shift, knowing Lyra would have no opportunity to notice the intrusion. "She threatened to dismiss my entire family from palace service if I refused," Petra said, tears streaming down her face, as guards escorted her before the king for formal questioning. "I didn't want to hurt anyone, my lord, I swear it. I only did what I was told." Damien listened to the confession with the same controlled stillness he brought to every difficult matter, though Lyra, who had been called to confirm certain details of the timeline, could see the tension building in his jaw, the barely suppressed fury simmering just beneath his composed exterior. "Where is Celine now?" he asked, once Petra's confession had been fully recorded. "In her chamber, my lord," a guard reported. "She's refused to leave since yesterday, claiming illness." "Bring her to me," Damien said. Now. The confrontation that followed took place not in the public spectacle of the Great Hall, but in Damien's private study, a room Lyra had never entered before, summoned there herself, to provide testimony should it be needed. She stood quietly near the wall, feeling deeply out of place among the heavy wooden furniture and towering shelves of books, watching as Celine was escorted into the room, her earlier confidence replaced by a brittle, defensive anger. "I don't know what lies that girl has told you," Celine began immediately, "but I assure you—" Petra confessed, Damien interrupted, his voice flat and final. "Every detail, the jeweler, the payment, the instructions to plant the necklace among Lyra's belongings. There is no room left for denial, Celine." For a moment, Celine's mask slipped entirely, revealing raw, unguarded fury beneath. "She's a servant," Celine spat, gesturing sharply toward Lyra. "A nobody from a broken pack, and you've spent the past week fawning over her like she's something precious, ignoring the woman you promised to make your queen. What was I supposed to do? Sit quietly while some healing trick and a pretty face threatened everything I've worked toward? You were supposed to behave with the dignity befitting someone who claims to deserve a crown," Damien said, his voice growing colder with each word. "Instead, You orchestrated a plot to have an innocent woman publicly flogged, based entirely on nothing more than your own jealousy and insecurity. Do you understand what you nearly did? Do you understand what could have happened to her young brother, based on a lie you fabricated? I understand that you've made me look like a fool in front of the entire court, Celine said, her voice rising. I understand that ever since that Eastern emissary arrived asking his ridiculous questions about lost bloodlines, you've looked at me differently, like I'm suddenly not enough. You made yourself look like a fool, Damien said. I only revealed the truth. Celine's eyes flashed toward Lyra, venom radiating from every line of her expression. This is her fault, all of it. Before she arrived, everything was settled between us. Nothing was ever settled between us, Damien said, and something in his voice, some final door closing, made even Celine fall silent. I tolerated you, because my council believed an alliance with your family would strengthen our position along the southern border. I never promised you a crown out of affection, Celine, and I think, if you're honest with yourself, you've always known that. The words landed with brutal clarity, and Lyra watched something break behind Celine's eyes, some carefully constructed fantasy collapsing in real time, before the entire room. As of this moment, Damien continued, you are stripped of your position as my intended mate. Your family's alliance with this kingdom will need to be renegotiated through more conventional means, without the added weight of a personal engagement that clearly never should have existed in the first place. You can't do this, Celine said, though the fight had visibly drained from her voice. My father will never accept this. Your father will accept whatever terms my council and I decide are fair, given the circumstances of your conduct, Damien said. I suggest you spend the coming days considering how fortunate you are, that I've chosen mercy over harsher consequences for what you attempted against an innocent member of my household. Celine's gaze swung once more toward Lyra, filled with a hatred so raw it made Lyra's skin prickle with unease. This isn't over, Celine said quietly, before turning and storming from the room, leaving a heavy, uncomfortable silence in her wake. Damien exhaled slowly, some of the tension leaving his shoulders now that the confrontation had ended. He turned toward Lyra, his expression shifting into something she hadn't seen from him before, something almost apologetic. I owe you an apology, he said. I should have recognized the danger you were in far sooner. I allowed my own distraction with council matters and border disputes to blind me to what was happening within my own household. That failure nearly cost you everything. You stopped the punishment before it happened, Lyra said quietly. That matters more than the delay. It shouldn't have needed to happen at all, Damien said, his voice carrying genuine frustration, though it seemed directed inward rather than at her. I am the Alpha King of this territory. Protecting the people within these walls, servant or noble, is meant to be my responsibility. I failed that responsibility with you, more than once, and I intend to correct that failure going forward. Lyra studied him carefully, uncertain how to respond to this unexpected shift in his demeanor. The cold, distant king she had grown accustomed to over the past months seemed, in this moment, almost human, burdened by guilt he clearly wasn't accustomed to carrying. Thank you, my lord, she said finally, for believing me today, when it mattered most. The truth wasn't difficult to find, once I bothered to look for it properly, Damien said. I only regret not looking sooner. He hesitated then, as though considering something further, before speaking again, his voice quieter now, more careful. The Eastern emissary believes you carry a significant bloodline. One connected to an old and powerful family thought lost decades ago. Edwin has shared his findings with me as well. Lyra's breath caught. You know. I know what the evidence suggests, Damien said. Whether it proves true or not, I intend to ensure you're protected either way. No one within these walls, noble or otherwise, will be permitted to threaten you again while you remain under my protection. Something in his voice, steady and sincere, settled a small measure of the fear that had been coiled tightly in her chest since Celine's accusation first echoed through the great hall. For the first time since her pack had been absorbed into this kingdom, since she had first knelt before this man as a servant assigned to serve his mistress, Lyra allowed herself to consider a possibility she had never dared entertain before. Perhaps her place within these walls was not as small and powerless as she had always believed. Perhaps, whatever truth waited to be uncovered about her bloodline, about her past, about the family she had never known existed beyond her simple farming parents. Something larger was beginning to take shape around her, whether she felt ready for it or not. She left Damien's study that evening with her mind full of questions still unanswered, but for the first time in months, beneath the uncertainty, something that felt remarkably, cautiously, like hope. Word of Celine's disgrace spread through the palace within hours, carried on the same whispered currents that had once spread rumors about Lyra's punishment. Servants who had previously kept careful distance now offered small kindnesses, a warm smile in the kitchen, an extra portion of bread left quietly on her tray, gestures that told Lyra the court had already begun rewriting its opinion of her, even before she fully understood what that opinion was shifting toward. But it was Callan's formal request, delivered 3 days after Celine's confrontation with the king, that changed everything entirely. Lyra was summoned once again to the Great Hall, though this time the atmosphere felt entirely different from the accusation that had nearly destroyed her. The court gathered with an air of curiosity rather than judgment, and at the front of the hall, Callan stood beside 2 other members of his entourage, dressed in formal robes marked with the silver crescent moon of the Eastern Kingdom. Damien sat upon the raised platform, his expression carefully neutral, though Lyra noticed the slight tension in his shoulders as Callan stepped forward to address the assembled court. "I have come before you today," Callan began, his voice carrying clearly across the silent hall, "on behalf of the Eastern Court, to formally present evidence regarding the identity of the woman known here as Lyra Ashford." He gestured, and one of his companions stepped forward, presenting an ornate scroll sealed with the Eastern Kingdom's official mark. 20 years ago, the Moonbound family, guardians of an ancient healing bloodline sacred to our people, was targeted during the border wars that swept through this region. Their territory was seized, their family scattered, and it was believed for 2 decades that the bloodline had been entirely extinguished, its unique gifts lost forever. He turned toward Lyra, his amber eyes steady and sincere. "Records recovered from surviving Moonbound retainers, combined with the testimony of your kingdom's own historian, and confirmed through the mark upon your wrist, provide compelling evidence that you are the last surviving heir of that bloodline. The daughter of Marin and Corwin Moonbound, smuggled to safety as an infant and raised under a different name to protect you from those who sought to eliminate your family entirely." The hall erupted into murmurs, nobles and servants alike whispering among themselves as they absorbed the enormity of the announcement. Lyra stood frozen at the center of it all, the weight of Callan's words settling over her like a physical force. "The Eastern Court formally requests," Callan continued, "that Lyra Ashford, rightful heir to the Moonbound line, return with us to claim her birthright as Princess of the Eastern Territories, and to help guide our people toward the healing our kingdom has desperately needed since the loss of her family 2 decades ago." The offer hung in the air, enormous and impossible, a complete reversal of everything Lyra's life had been for the past 3 months, and indeed for her entire 22 years of existence. A crown, a kingdom, a family history finally restored to her after a lifetime of believing herself ordinary. She glanced toward Damien, uncertain what she hoped to find in his expression, and saw something there that surprised her, a tightness around his eyes, a stillness that suggested he was working very hard to maintain his composure. "This is a significant offer," Damien said finally, his voice carefully measured. "One that deserves serious consideration. Lyra Ashford is, of course, free to make whatever decision she believes serves her best." Free. The word felt strange, unfamiliar, after months of having so little control over her own circumstances. Lyra looked between Callan's earnest, hopeful expression and Damien's carefully guarded one, aware that the entire hall waited breathlessly for her response. "I need time to consider this," she said finally, her voice steadier than she expected. "This is not a decision I can make in a single moment, standing before an entire court." "Of course," Callan said, though disappointment flickered briefly across his face. "Take whatever time you require. My entourage will remain in the palace for the coming days, and I hope you'll consider carefully what returning to your true home might offer you and your brother." The mention of Finn sent a fresh wave of complexity through Lyra's already overwhelmed mind. A crown for herself was one enormous decision. A crown that would also mean uprooting her younger brother, tearing him away from the only life he currently knew, was another matter entirely. The court began to disperse following the announcement, though Lyra remained rooted in place for several long moments, overwhelmed by the sheer scope of what had just been revealed. It was Damien who eventually approached her, his expression unreadable, though something in his posture suggested careful restraint. "Walk with me," he said quietly, and she followed him from the hall into a quiet garden courtyard she had rarely visited during her months of service, a peaceful space, filled with flowering shrubs and the gentle sound of a small fountain. They walked in silence for several minutes before Damien finally spoke. "I imagine this is a great deal to absorb." "That's an understatement," Lyra said, allowing herself a small, tired laugh. 3 months ago, I was mourning my parents and worrying about how to keep my brother fed. Now I'm being told I'm secretly a princess, with an offer to rule an entire kingdom. "How do you feel about it?" Damien asked, his tone carefully neutral, though Lyra sensed genuine interest beneath the careful control. "Overwhelmed," she admitted. "Uncertain. Part of me wants to run toward this offer, toward the family history I never knew I had, toward a life where I'm not simply enduring whatever cruelty comes my way. But another part of me is terrified. I don't know anything about ruling a kingdom. I don't know these Eastern people, their customs, their expectations. And I don't know if uprooting Finn's entire life is fair to him, simply because of a truth I only discovered days ago." "Those are reasonable fears," Damien said. "Though I suspect, whatever choice you make, you'll navigate it with more grace than you're currently giving yourself credit for." Lyra glanced at him, surprised by the quiet sincerity in his voice. "You seem oddly invested in my decision, my lord. For someone who was, until recently, entirely indifferent to my existence." Something flickered across his expression, something that looked almost like discomfort, or perhaps regret. "I wasn't indifferent," he said finally. "I simply failed to act on what I noticed, for reasons I'm still working through myself." They stopped near the fountain, and Damien turned to face her fully, his ice-pale eyes holding an intensity that made her breath catch slightly. "I won't pretend the timing of this revelation is uncomplicated," he said. "You arrived in my household as a servant assigned to a woman who treated you cruelly, and within weeks, you've been revealed as a princess, with a legitimate claim to an entire kingdom. I have no right to ask you to consider anything beyond what serves your own interests and your brother's well-being." "But," Lyra prompted, sensing there was more he intended to say. "But I find myself, against my better judgment, hoping you don't accept the Eastern Court's offer, without at least considering what remains for you here," Damien said, his voice quieter now, more vulnerable than she had ever heard it. "This kingdom, this palace, could offer you a place as well, should you choose it. Not as a servant, never again as a servant." The implication hung heavy in the air between them, and Lyra felt her pulse quicken, uncertain how to interpret the weight behind his words, uncertain whether hope was something she could afford to indulge in yet, given everything still unresolved. "I need time," she said finally, echoing her earlier response to Callan, though this time the words felt different, carrying a complexity she hadn't fully acknowledged even to herself. "Too much has changed too quickly for me to make any decision with a clear mind." "Take whatever time you need," Damien said. "I won't pressure you further. I only wanted you to know that whatever you decide, you won't be deciding it based on incomplete information about what awaits you here." They stood together in the quiet garden a moment longer, the gentle sound of the fountain filling the silence between them, before Lyra finally excused herself, her mind spinning with possibilities she had never imagined having to consider, her heart caught between the promise of a birthright finally restored, and a quiet, unexpected pull toward a man, and a place she had never intended to call home. Whatever she chose in the coming days would reshape not only her own life, but Finn's future as well, and the weight of that responsibility settled over her as she made her way back toward the small room they shared, uncertain how she would even begin explaining any of this to her brother, let alone decide her own path forward. Finn took the news better than Lyra expected, though his reaction came with its own tangle of complicated emotions that neither of them fully knew how to untangle. "A princess," he said, sitting cross-legged on his bed, turning his carved wolf figure over and over in his hands, a habit he'd developed whenever he needed something familiar to hold on to. "You're actually a princess." "Apparently," Lyra said, sitting beside him, still struggling to fully believe the word applied to her own life. "Though I don't feel any different than I did yesterday, when I was just your sister who happened to be good at scrubbing floors." Finn allowed himself a small smile, though it faded quickly, replaced by a more serious expression that seemed too old for his 12 years. "Are we going to leave? Go live in the Eastern Kingdom?" "I don't know yet," Lyra said honestly. "I haven't decided anything. But whatever I decide, I want you to know that your feelings matter in this decision too. This isn't just about what I want or need. It's about what's best for both of us." "I don't want to lose you," Finn said quietly, his voice small, in a way that reminded Lyra painfully of the frightened boy who had clung to her hand the day they'd left their burned village behind, the day their entire world had changed for the first time. "If you become a princess somewhere far away, and I stay here, or if we go together but everything's different and complicated, I'm scared we'll lose what we have now." Lyra pulled him into a tight embrace, feeling his small shoulders shake slightly against her chest. "You will never lose me," she said fiercely. "Wherever I go, whatever I become, you come with me. That's not negotiable, not for a crown, not for anything. Do you understand?" Finn nodded against her shoulder, some of the tension easing from his small frame. "Okay," he said. "Okay. I trust you." They sat together for a long while after that, talking through the enormity of everything that had happened, working through fears and hopes in the fragmented, honest way that only siblings who had survived loss together could manage. By the time Finn finally drifted off to sleep, Lyra felt no closer to a decision, but somehow lighter, having shared the weight of it with the one person whose opinion mattered most to her. The following days passed in a strange, suspended quality, as Lyra continued her palace duties while simultaneously navigating meetings with Callan, who patiently answered every question she had about the Eastern Kingdom, about the moonbound legacy, about what her life might look like should she choose to claim her birthright. "The kingdom has struggled since your family's line was lost," Callan explained during one such conversation, as they walked together through the palace gardens, his eastern robes catching the afternoon light. "Old feuds between border packs have festered without the moonbound gift to help mend them. Your return, and the restoration of that healing ability to our royal line, could bring genuine stability to a region that's needed it for 2 decades. That's an enormous responsibility to place on someone who only learned of this bloodline a week ago," Lyra said, though she found herself genuinely moved by the earnestness in Callan's voice, by the evident hope he carried for his kingdom's future. "I understand the weight of what I'm asking," Callan said. "I don't expect you to embrace this transition easily, or without significant adjustment, but I believe, given time, you could become the leader our kingdom desperately needs. Someone who understands what it means to have lost everything and rebuilt from nothing. That resilience matters more than any crown." His words settled into Lyra's thoughts alongside Damien's quiet admission in the garden days earlier, the two possibilities weighing against each other in her mind, like stones balanced on a scale that refused to settle in either direction. It was during one of these contemplative walks that Celine made her final, desperate attempt to reclaim the position she had lost. Lyra found her waiting in the corridor, outside the small room she shared with Finn, her earlier fury replaced by something quieter, more calculated, though no less dangerous for its restraint. "I hear you're considering the Eastern Court's offer," Celine said, falling into step beside Lyra as she walked. "How convenient that you'd disappear entirely from this kingdom, leaving the Alpha King free to move on from whatever brief fascination he's developed for you." "I haven't made any decision yet," Lyra said carefully, unwilling to give Celine any additional ammunition for whatever scheme she was clearly attempting to construct. "Perhaps I could help you decide," Celine said, her voice taking on a honeyed quality that immediately put Lyra on guard. "The Eastern Kingdom offers you a crown, true, but also enormous responsibility, unfamiliar customs, a people who don't yet know or trust you. Here, you remain a servant, tolerated only because of the king's temporary curiosity, which will fade, I promise you, the moment something more interesting captures his attention." "Is there a point to this conversation?" Lyra asked, growing weary of Celine's manipulations. "Only this," Celine said, stopping to face her directly. "Take the Eastern offer, leave this kingdom, and leave Damien to me. I'm certain, given time, my family's alliance can be renegotiated successfully, and everything can return to how it was always meant to be. That's not my decision to make based on what benefits you, Lyra said, her patience finally fraying. I'll decide based on what's best for myself and my brother, not based on whatever fantasy you're still clinging to about ruling beside a man who's already told you plainly that he never intended to give you a crown. Celine's composure cracked slightly, fury flashing briefly across her expression before she forced it back down. You'll regret dismissing me so easily, she said quietly, before turning and walking away, her footsteps echoing sharply down the corridor. Lyra watched her go, unease settling in her stomach, though she pushed the feeling aside, unwilling to let Celine's bitterness distract her from the far larger decision still awaiting her resolution. That evening, as the palace settled into its familiar evening rhythms, Lyra found herself once again in the quiet garden courtyard, drawn there by some instinct she didn't fully examine, and unsurprised, somehow, to find Damien already present, standing near the fountain, with his hands clasped behind his back, lost in thought. "You're here often lately," he observed, without turning immediately to face her. "It's peaceful," Lyra said, joining him near the fountain's edge. "I needed somewhere quiet to think." "Have you reached a decision?" he asked, finally turning to look at her, his expression carefully neutral, though she could sense the tension beneath his composure. "Almost," Lyra said honestly. "I keep weighing everything. The kingdom I could help heal, the birthright I never knew I had, against the life I've started building here, complicated as it's been." She paused, gathering her thoughts. "Can I ask you something honestly, and trust that you'll answer just as honestly in return?" "Always," Damien said. "If I stayed," Lyra said carefully, "what exactly would that mean?" "You said this palace could offer me a place, not as a servant, but what does that actually look like, practically speaking?" Damien was quiet for a long moment, studying her with an intensity that made her pulse quicken, despite her effort to remain composed. "It would mean," he said finally, "that I would ask you to remain here, not as anyone's servant, but as someone I hope to know far better than I currently do. Someone whose company I find myself seeking out more with each passing day, for reasons that have very little to do with ancient bloodlines or political advantage." The admission hung in the quiet evening air between them, honest and unguarded in a way Lyra hadn't expected from a man who had spent months maintaining careful, controlled distance from everyone around him, herself included. "That's a significant thing to admit," she said softly. "It is," Damien agreed. "And I recognize the timing is far from ideal, given everything else you're navigating right now. I only wanted you to have complete honesty as you make whatever choice ultimately serves you best." Lyra studied him for a long moment, weighing his words against everything else swirling through her mind. The crown waiting for her in the east, the healing legacy she carried within her blood, the brother whose future depended on whatever she chose next, and this man before her, whose careful, guarded heart seemed to be opening toward her in a way she hadn't anticipated, and wasn't entirely certain how to navigate. "I need one more day," she said finally. "Tomorrow, I'll give my answer, to both you and Callan." Damien nodded, respecting the space she'd requested, though something in his eyes suggested the wait would not be an easy one for him either. Lyra left the garden that evening with her heart and mind still tangled together in uncertainty, though somewhere beneath the confusion, a clarity had begun, slowly, quietly, to take shape. Morning arrived with a clarity Lyra hadn't expected, the kind that comes not from certainty, but from finally allowing herself to stop running from a decision she had, on some level, already made days earlier without fully admitting it to herself. She woke before dawn, careful not to disturb Finn, and made her way to the small window of their shared room, watching the sky shift slowly from deep violet to soft gray as the sun began its climb over the eastern hills. Somewhere beyond those hills lay a kingdom that carried her family's forgotten name, a birthright waiting to be claimed, a people hoping for healing she wasn't certain she knew how to provide. And somewhere within these very walls lay a different kind of possibility entirely, uncertain in its own way, but built on something Lyra hadn't expected to find within a palace that had first welcomed her only as a servant, meant to endure whatever cruelty came her way. She thought of her parents, of the secret they had carried and protected until their final days, of the sacrifice they had made to keep her safe from a truth too dangerous for a child to carry. She thought of Edwin's careful research, of Callan's earnest hope, of Celine's bitter jealousy, and of Damien's quiet, unguarded admission beside the fountain the previous evening. By the time Finn stirred awake, rubbing sleep from his eyes, Lyra had made her decision, though she kept it close for a while longer, wanting to share it first with the people it would affect most directly. She found Callan in the palace gardens shortly after breakfast, standing near the same fountain where she had spoken with Damien the night before, his expression hopeful despite the visible tension in his posture. "You've decided," he said, reading the resolve in her expression before she'd spoken a word. "I have," Lyra confirmed, taking a steadying breath before continuing. "Callan, I am deeply grateful for everything you've done, for finding me, for helping me understand a truth about my family I never knew existed. The moonbound legacy matters to me now, in ways I couldn't have imagined a week ago, and I don't intend to abandon that heritage entirely." Hope flickered brighter in Callan's amber eyes. But I won't be returning with you to claim the Eastern throne," Lyra said gently. "Not because I don't care about your kingdom's healing, or because I don't value what my bloodline represents, but because I believe my place, at least for now, is here, building something new, rather than stepping into a role and a kingdom I barely understand, among people who don't yet know me beyond a name and a bloodline." Callan absorbed her words quietly, disappointment evident but tempered by understanding. "I suspected this might be your answer," he admitted, "though I hoped otherwise. Our kingdom will continue to search for ways to heal, without your direct rule, though I confess, having found you after 20 years of searching, it's difficult to simply let that connection go." "You don't have to," Lyra said. "I would welcome an ongoing relationship with the Eastern Kingdom, as an ally, rather than as its ruler. Perhaps in time, I could visit, help where I'm able, without abandoning the life I'm building here." Something in Callan's expression softened at that. "I would like that very much," he said. "And perhaps, in time, your own children might carry the moonbound gift forward, into whatever future awaits them, wherever that future takes place." The comment, offered lightly, still sent an unexpected flush of warmth through Lyra's cheeks, her thoughts drifting briefly toward Damien, before she pulled them carefully back to the present conversation. "Thank you, Callan," she said sincerely, "for everything. For giving me the truth about my family, even when it would have been easier for everyone if you'd simply let the moonbound line fade quietly into history. Some truths deserve to be spoken, regardless of how complicated they make things," Callan said, offering her a warm, genuine smile. "I wish you every happiness, Lyra Ashford, whatever name you ultimately choose to carry forward." They parted with mutual respect, and Lyra felt a weight lift from her shoulders. One decision now firmly settled, though the larger, more personal question still awaited her attention. She found Damien in his study later that afternoon, poring over documents related to the ongoing border negotiations, his expression tightening with familiar tension, before easing slightly as he noticed her entrance. "You've spoken with Callan," he said, setting aside his papers. "I have," Lyra confirmed, stepping further into the room. "I've declined the Eastern throne." Something shifted visibly in Damien's expression, relief and cautious hope mingling together in a way that made Lyra's heart quicken. "May I ask why?" "Because a crown isn't something you simply inherit and know how to wear," Lyra said. "It's something you grow into, through understanding, through connection, through genuinely knowing the people you're meant to serve. I don't have that with the Eastern Kingdom. Not yet. Perhaps not ever in the way they'd need from a ruler." "And here?" Damien asked carefully. "Here," Lyra said, meeting his gaze directly. "I've spent 3 months learning this palace, its people, its struggles and its strengths, even while enduring far more difficulty than anyone should have to endure. I've watched you struggle to balance duty with genuine care for the people under your protection, even when you failed at first to notice what was happening within your own household. I've seen you correct that failure, publicly, at real cost to your political alliances, because it mattered to you to do what was right." She paused, gathering courage for what came next. "I don't know exactly what building something between us would look like, Damien. I don't know if it's wise, given everything that's happened, given how complicated my position here has been, until very recently. But I find myself wanting to find out, rather than walking away toward a crown that, however meaningful, would mean leaving behind a possibility I'm not ready to abandon." Damien crossed the room slowly, stopping close enough that Lyra could see the genuine emotion in his ice-pale eyes, warmer now than she had ever witnessed them. "I don't take that decision lightly," he said. "You deserve someone who sees your full worth, not simply as a healer with a valuable bloodline, and not simply as a convenient political solution to whatever alliance concerns my council raises. You deserve to be valued for exactly who you are, Lyra Ashford, moonbound heir or otherwise." "Then show me," Lyra said softly, "that you're capable of being that person." "I intend to," Damien said, his voice carrying quiet, unwavering conviction. "Starting now, and continuing, for as long as you'll allow me the privilege." The moment stretched between them, charged with possibility, before Damien reached out slowly, giving her every opportunity to step back should she choose, and gently took her hand in his own. The gesture simple, but weighted with meaning, neither of them needed to voice aloud. Word of Lyra's decision spread through the palace with predictable speed, and while most of the court received the news with genuine warmth, having witnessed Celine's cruelty and Lyra's quiet dignity firsthand over recent weeks, Celine herself received it with an entirely different reaction. She confronted Lyra one final time, 3 days later, in the same corridor where their earlier confrontation had taken place, though this time, her fury had curdled into something colder, more desperate. "You've won," Celine said bitterly. "Is that what you wanted all along? To steal everything from me, my position, my future, using some conveniently discovered bloodline as your excuse?" "I never wanted to steal anything from you," Lyra said calmly, no longer intimidated by Celine's anger the way she had once been. "I only wanted to survive, and eventually, to be treated with the basic dignity every person deserves. Whatever happened between you and Damien happened because of choices you made, not because of anything I did to sabotage you." "You'll regret this," Celine hissed, though the threat carried less weight now, hollowed out by her fading influence within the palace. "One day, you'll understand what it feels like to lose everything you thought was yours." "Perhaps," Lyra said quietly. "But I've already lost everything once, Celine. My parents, my home, my entire understanding of who I was. I survived that loss, and I built something new from what remained. If you're truly determined to hate me for finding happiness after everything I've endured, that says far more about you than it does about me." Celine had no response to that, her fury finally exhausting itself against the calm, unshakable resolve Lyra had built over months of quiet endurance. She turned and walked away without another word, and Lyra understood, watching her go, that this particular chapter of conflict had finally, truly, ended. Within the month, Celine's family formally withdrew their bid for alliance through marriage, accepting instead a more modest trade agreement negotiated through Damien's council. Celine herself departed the palace shortly after, her ambitions for a crown permanently unrealized, and though whispers of her name occasionally drifted through palace gossip in the following months, her direct influence over Lyra's life faded entirely. A storm finally passed. 6 months passed with a quiet, steady grace that Lyra had never expected her life could hold, each week bringing small, meaningful changes that gradually reshaped everything she had once believed possible for herself. She remained within the palace, no longer as a servant assigned to endure another's cruelty, but as someone gradually finding her place among a court still adjusting to the reality of her moonbound heritage. Edwin continued his research into the old bloodline, uncovering new details about her family's history with each passing month, small fragments of a past finally being restored to her piece by careful piece. Finn thrived in ways that brought tears of gratitude to Lyra's eyes more than once. Given proper tutoring alongside other palace children, given space to be a boy, rather than a constant source of worry, weighing on his older sister's shoulders. He had taken to carving with renewed enthusiasm, his small wolf figures growing more detailed and confident with practice, several of them now displayed proudly in their considerably larger, more comfortable palace quarters. And Damien, true to his quiet promise beside the garden fountain, had shown Lyra, through countless small gestures and steady consistency, exactly the kind of person he intended to be for her going forward. He sought her counsel on matters affecting the kingdom's more vulnerable citizens, listened genuinely to her perspective on issues she understood intimately from her months as a servant, and gradually, carefully, allowed her to see past the controlled, distant king the court had always known toward the thoughtful, occasionally uncertain man beneath that careful exterior. Their relationship developed slowly, built on genuine conversation and mutual respect, rather than the political convenience that had once defined Damien's arrangement with Celine. It was during a quiet evening in the palace gardens, nearly 7 months after Celine's disgrace, that Damien finally asked Lyra the question that had been building steadily between them for months. "I've spoken with my council," he said, as they walked together beneath a sky scattered with stars, the fountain's gentle sound providing familiar background music to a conversation that felt, somehow, both significant and comfortable. "About the possibility of formalizing an alliance between us, should you be willing." Lyra stopped walking, turning to face him fully. "An alliance," she repeated carefully. "Is that what this would be to you? Political convenience, dressed up in warmer language than what you offered Celine?" Damien's expression shifted, something almost hurt flickering across his features. "No," he said firmly. "That's not what I meant at all, and I apologize if my words suggested otherwise. What I'm asking, Lyra, has nothing to do with political convenience, and everything to do with the fact that I cannot imagine continuing to build my future without you standing beside me as I do it." He reached into his pocket, withdrawing a small object that caught the moonlight as he opened his palm, revealing a ring crafted with careful, deliberate beauty, a band of silver wrapped around a stone that seemed to shift between deep blue and soft silver depending on the angle of the light, unmistakably reminiscent of moonlight itself. "I had this made specifically for you," Damien said, his voice carrying a vulnerability Lyra had rarely witnessed from him, even in their most private conversations. Not as a political symbol, not as a strategic alliance, but as a genuine request. "Lyra Ashford, heir to the moonbound line, would you consider becoming my queen? Not because of what your bloodline offers this kingdom, though I won't pretend that heritage isn't valuable, but because I have come to genuinely, deeply care for who you are as a person. Someone who endured cruelty with grace, who found strength in circumstances that would have broken many others, who continues to think of others' well-being, even when the world has given her every reason to think only of her own survival." Tears gathered in Lyra's eyes, unexpected and overwhelming, as she absorbed the sincerity behind his words, so different from the calculated political maneuvering that had once defined her understanding of royal courtship. "Damien," she said softly, 6 months ago, I was scrubbing floors on my knees, while your mistress screamed insults at me in front of the entire court. Are you certain the court, your council, everyone who witnessed that humiliation, will accept me now as your queen?" "I care far less about what the court accepts than about what genuinely matters," Damien said. "And what matters is that you have proven yourself, time and again, worthy of respect that has nothing to do with bloodlines or crowns. Any member of my court, who cannot see that truth clearly by now, has no place offering judgment on who deserves to rule beside me." Lyra studied him for a long moment, memories flooding through her mind, the humiliation of those early weeks, the fear of Celine's accusations, the uncertainty of discovering her hidden heritage, and finally, the slow, steady building of genuine connection with the man standing before her now, offering not a crown born of obligation, but a partnership born of choice. "Yes," she said finally, her voice steady, despite the tears still gathered in her eyes. "Yes, Damien, I will become your queen." He slipped the ring onto her finger with careful, reverent hands, and when he finally pulled her into an embrace, Lyra felt, for the first time since her family's simple farming life had been shattered by tragedy so many months ago, a sense of belonging she had never expected to find again. Their wedding took place 2 months later, in a ceremony that drew nobles and common folk alike, the entire kingdom eager to witness the joining of their Alpha King, with the woman whose remarkable journey from servant to queen had already become something of a legend whispered throughout the territory. Lyra stood before the gathered crowd in a gown of pale silver silk, her moon-bound crescent mark deliberately left uncovered on her wrist, no longer something to hide, but something to embrace, as an essential part of her identity. Finn stood proudly beside her, no longer the frightened boy who had clutched her hand while fleeing their burned village, but a confident young man who had found, alongside his sister, an unexpected but genuine home. Callan attended as well, representing the Eastern Kingdom's continued friendship, his earlier disappointment long since transformed into genuine happiness for the woman he had spent 20 years searching to find. "Perhaps," he said quietly to Lyra during the celebration following the ceremony, "this outcome serves both our kingdoms better than the one I originally hoped for. an alliance built on genuine friendship, rather than a single ruler stretched between two very different responsibilities. "I hope so," Lyra said, smiling warmly at the man who had first revealed the truth of her heritage, forever changing the course of her life. "The moonbound gift doesn't need to live within a single throne to heal what needs mending. I intend to use it wherever it's needed, regardless of which kingdom happens to call for it." As the celebration continued late into the evening, Lyra found herself standing on the palace balcony, looking out over the kingdom she now called home, Damien's steady presence beside her, his hand intertwined with hers. "Do you have any regrets?" he asked quietly, watching the last of the celebration lights flicker in the courtyard below, "about choosing to stay, rather than claiming the Eastern throne?" Lyra considered the question seriously before answering, thinking back over everything that had led her to this moment, the humiliation and fear of those first difficult months, the terrifying revelation of her hidden heritage, the slow, careful building of trust and genuine affection with the man now standing beside her as her husband. "No regrets," she said finally, with complete certainty. "Every difficult moment led me exactly here, to this life I never could have imagined for myself, standing beside someone who values me not for a bloodline or a political advantage, but simply for who I am." She thought of the servant girl who had once knelt on cold stone floors, enduring cruelty with quiet dignity, never imagining that her patience and inner strength would eventually lead her toward genuine happiness and purpose. That girl had survived, had endured, had refused to let bitterness define her even during the darkest days of Celine's cruelty, and that resilience had ultimately carried her toward a future far brighter than anything she could have imagined during those early, difficult months. "The kingdom is fortunate to have you," Damien said softly, pulling her closer against the cool evening air. "We're fortunate to have found each other," Lyra corrected gently, resting her head against his shoulder as they watched the stars emerge fully across the darkening sky. "Whatever challenges come next, whatever the future holds for this kingdom, for the Eastern territories, for the healing my bloodline might offer, wherever it's needed most, I intend to face it as your equal, your partner, and your queen. Not because circumstance forced this path upon me, but because I chose it, freely and completely." Below them, the kingdom continued its celebration, unaware that the servant girl once forced to serve a cruel mistress had become, through resilience and quiet strength rather than the mere accident of bloodline, exactly the kind of queen this kingdom had always needed. One who understood intimately what it meant to suffer, to endure, and ultimately, to heal not just wounds of the body, but the deeper wounds that had long divided people who deserved, more than anything, genuine compassion and understanding from those who ruled over them. And as the last stars fully emerged over the palace, Lyra Ashford, once servant, now queen, allowed herself, finally and completely, to embrace the happiness she had fought so hard, for so long, to find.